Jason X, The Experiment. Chapter 14. The one question science might never answer, she thought, as she straightened up from the magnificent specimen on the table, was why there were so many more horses' asses than there were horses. Not to mention how it was that, whenever she got rid of one, she would have barely 30 blessedly ass-free minutes before another one showed up. Dr. Stein was no fonder of Gunnar Gottman than any of his colleagues were. It had nothing to do with the fact that his unapologetic and brazen ambition had caused him to put his head so far up her ass that she could almost feel a lump in her throat. It wasn't even that she would have preferred someone else's head instead of his. Neither was it his tendency to walk around naked in his off hours or his vanity in general, or his ridiculous sex drive. And it most certainly wasn't because she had an unrequited yearning for him, or vice versa, in which case she would only have disliked him even more. Her antipathy to Gunnar Gottman was due in good part to the fact that he was there purely as a favor to a member of command who happened to be his uncle, but also just on general principle. Like everyone else, he was beneath her and didn't have the sense to know it. Dealing with him stole precious periods of time from her life, time that could have been put to far better use. Once in a great while, however, Gottman was actually of some real use to her. Even so, she was no more inclined to be favorably disposed toward him on these occasions, thanks in large part to his obvious belief that such occasions could in some way elevate his status to something more than a waste of space. Not that his attitude made any real difference one way or another. There were no circumstances under which she would ever find the man acceptable. Now, as she forced herself to tolerate his presence in her office, she thought that acquiring the new specimen must have improved her frame of mind enough to have raised her irritation threshold. She felt less active loathing toward him at the moment than she usually did. But then, since she was still in the lab, there was a thick glass partition between them. A pity it was the plain old kind without any opaquing function. She would have preferred it if she could have been spared the sight of Gottman completely, particularly that fatuous, toothy smile. On the other hand, at least he wasn't naked. I don't know who Cossey Fantoot persuaded to put a tap on your buffers. I don't know who did that, Gottman was saying, or how it works. But if you give me a few hours, half a day or possibly less, I can put someone to work on a process to counter it. By proxy, of course, not directly. I wouldn't allow some low-rent techie near your system, let alone actually touch it. Any more than I would expect you to grant me even very limited access. Once the counter program was developed, I would simply send it to you with an auto-installer. Stein stretched her mouth in what he would have to pretend was an approximation of a smile from someone with too much on her mind to manage the real thing. Thank you. I'll watch for its arrival in my inbox. Was there anything else that you thought I should know about? He hesitated. You're not going to like this one at all. She suppressed a sigh and looked down at the sterile cap she had put over the top of the specimen's head, wondering how much longer it would be until she could get back to exploring the inside of the skull. Somehow, all of the soldiers in the clinic have been infected with the virus. Stein continued to stare down at the specimen, forcing herself to show no reaction. Her gaze wandered to the eyes, still wide open and unblinking. Why did his face look like a mask? After a pause, she raised her head to look at the man on the other side of the glass. Somehow? I'm afraid I don't know which virus or how it was introduced, but... Care to guess? She asked, her voice deceptively louder. Well, if I were to look around for an immediate source, Gottman said slowly, the new intern would be the first on my list. Stein nodded once. Go on. The man looked smug now, as well as fatuous. First, there's the most obvious reason. She's been outside the complex most recently. Now exactly how she could smuggle in an infectious... I meant, go on and look at the new intern as the possible cause of infection. Intentionally or otherwise, Stein interrupted, no longer going to any trouble to keep the impatience out of her voice. For a moment, he just stood there gaping at her in surprise. You mean it? She glanced up at the ceiling in annoyance. Why wouldn't I? No, I'm sorry, I know, it's just... He floundered, his pinkish face surprised, thrilled, and nervous all at once. Sorry, Dr. Stein, I'll get right on this. Thank you for putting your trust in me. I'll take care of it right away. Right away would be good. Christ, he sounded like a fucking intern. She took another longer look at the ceiling and was relieved to find he was gone by the time she looked down again. Instead of resuming her exploration of the specimen's skull, however, she took a seat on the adjustable stool next to the operating table and let what Gutman had just told her sink in. The rabble was getting awfully bold, she thought. To pull a stunt like this. She couldn't decide how likely it was that Wing had been directly involved, and then concluded that it didn't really matter. Given the chance, he would have been. Unbidden, a new idea began to take shape in her mind. Even before it had all come together, she understood that it was a much better plan. Unorthodox in terms of procedure, as it meant skipping over certain steps, which would in turn up the danger factor. There were going to be fatalities, that was guaranteed, and not the usual kind. But it would yield a faster result, and the military certainly wasn't going to find fault with her for that. In the end, this would actually put her ahead of schedule. But the fact that it would also serve to teach the rabble a serious and unforgettable lesson about trying to fuck her over was pure, sweet icing on the most delicious cake. Lynn estimated that the boy in the tube was about 7 or 8 years old. He might have been younger. When it came to judging children's ages, she had very little in the way of experience. She was fairly sure that he could not have been any older. She was also absolutely certain that she had never seen a more beautiful child. His straw-colored hair fell to his shoulders, framing a face with the round cheeks and upturned nose characteristic of children who have years to go before the world begins to change. The position of his mouth in repose made it seem as if he were on the verge of smiling in his sleep. He might have been in the midst of a particularly pleasant dream from which he would awaken at any moment. That's what makes the sight of him so horrifying, Lynn thought, breathing slowly and deeply through her nose in a concerted effort to keep from throwing up. It wasn't the cable feeding directly into his brain through the glass partition set into the top of his head, or the hardware clamped to his bruised temples. Nor was it the tracheal tube coming out of his throat, or the half-natural, half-artificial umbilical cord that snaked out of the center of his belly and under his left arm to connect with something behind him. It wasn't even the vat itself, which Lynn thought should have been called a pod. The long, transparent capsule where the boy lay with his body partially submerged in a colorless substance that made her think of jellyfish. It was how utterly normal and natural he seemed. "That is not a child," Dr. Gold said on her left. He was looking at her rather than the boy in the vat, and she could sense the pity in his gaze. "It's only tissue in a shape that humans would identify as a male child. It's really just a cloned organism passing through one of its immature forms as part of the growth process. In 6 hours it'll be fully grown, nowhere nearly as pretty, and no more a man than it was a boy. Not in the true spirit of those terms." Lynn said nothing. At least his eyes remained closed. She could be grateful for that much. Another moment like the one she had with Sophia was about the last thing she needed. Twitching muscles due to random neuronal misfires. That was a good one. She wondered if Haddad O'Reilly had made the nurse practice that one until she was absolutely sure he could say it with a straight face. She continued to concentrate on her breathing. "Not what you were expecting?" Dr. Gold asked her. She couldn't decide whether she was really hearing an oddly light, almost taunting tone in his voice, or just imagining it. "The standard hospitals and medical centers all grow cloned organs in skin bags," he said. "But what most people don't know is that it actually takes some extra time and effort to keep skin bags from looking too human. It's not a massive amount of time and effort, and it's not a terribly difficult procedure, really. But since it is something extra, it does add to the cost. That is something that Dr. Stein has always felt was completely unnecessary." He paused briefly and then went on, his voice becoming more brittle with every word. "Dr. Stein says if we're able to overcome our characteristic cultural sensitivity to the matter of appearance and understand that the resemblance in this case is nothing other than superficial, we could reduce the cost of producing replacement limbs and organs to a fraction of what it is now. She even has a complete set of charts and spreadsheets that project in detail exactly how much money and time could be saved over a 10-year period." The scientific research community as a whole was not swayed by her arguments. But within the confines of this project, her word is final, no appeal. The military are interested in results, not what her skin bags look like, and they're not averse to saving a little money. Lynn made a polite noise of acknowledgement. "Are you feeling unwell, as if you might faint or throw up?" Dr. Gold asked her, the brittle tone completely absent from his voice. Before she could answer, he took hold of her elbow again and steered her past the growth vats into a darkened area of the lab. Lights flickered on automatically. Not standard indoor lights, but simulated daylight, which emanated from sources placed in such a way as to suggest the presence of large windows. It was a fairly popular style of lighting, but it didn't always work. Sometimes the room was too large or too small or the wrong color. Or the furnishings contradicted the illusion, which Lynn would have thought would be the case in any kind of laboratory, even one with real windows. But somehow, even with all those workspaces and consoles and equipment, the desired effect had been achieved, something which Lynn couldn't help feeling profoundly grateful. "It's been a very rough day for you," Gold observed with a studied neutrality. He set the slender metal case of tissue samples on top of a work table. "I must say, this is not the day I was expecting to have myself. I have never seen any clinic patients transferred to pre-op without someone taking a set of tissue samples from them first." He paused to look even sadder than usual. "And the instant epidemic?" Lynn asked, hoping the question didn't really sound quite so arch to him as it did to her own ears. "How often does that happen?" "I really couldn't tell you," he replied, his voice turning politely distant and even a little prim, as if she had asked him something embarrassingly intimate. "But if I had to guess," he surprised her with a sudden wry half-smile, "I'd say often enough to justify all the fuss and bother of full-body condoms. Otherwise, we'd be stuck in quarantine now, too, with the distinct disadvantage of not being able to sleep through it." As he spoke, he opened the case and removed the tissue sample containers, handing the small silver cubes carefully as he put them on the workbench. He had collected only a dozen samples before Dr. Haddad O'Reilly had told them an infection of unknown origin had broken out among the patients, and the two of them would have to leave. "Why are the soldiers being kept sedated?" Lynn joined him at the workbench, standing on the opposite side. "Orders." "Whose?" "Dr. Stein's, of course." "Isn't that kind of unusual, keeping them unconscious for so long?" He glanced up in some surprise, as if he had neither expected her to ask such a question, nor understood why she had. Then he made a vague gesture toward the counter behind him. "Bring over some stasis chambers, will you?" Lynn moved to obey, and then stopped, scanning the length of the counter for anything that might have been both chamber-like and suggestive of stasis. The only thing she could think of was a thermos, and she saw nothing like that. "Second shelf directly above the bacteria catalog," Gold added, without looking up from whatever he was doing with his tablets. "Which is the red storage unit that looks like a miniature refrigerator and says, 'Bacteria Catalog' on the front." "Right, sorry. I guess my eyes haven't adjusted to decent illumination." It took 4 trips for her to ferry over the right number of small but somewhat heavy objects. They didn't seem so much like chambers as they did votive candles from one of those retro churches her mother had been so fascinated with for a while. The inside even looked and smelled a lot like wax. Gold thanked her and then moved one of the chambers to the corner of the workbench so he could show her what to do. "You take one of the samples and set it down in the center," he said, doing so. "Try very hard to get it as dead center as possible. Watch it carefully, and after a few seconds you'll see the cube starting to sink." He bent down so he could look at it roughly the same level as the cube. "Do you see how it started sinking a little?" Lynn bent down to look at it from the same level. "I'm not... Oh, yes, now I see it." "When it starts to sink, press down on it firmly, but not too hard, until it won't go down any further, like this." He showed her. "Then wait for it to sink some more, and then press down again. Continue until the cube finally sinks below the surface of the chamber." "Then what?" "Then put it to one side and do the next one. It's a simple but effective method of hurrying nano-integration." Gold straightened up. "When you've done all of them, clock out and have a nice evening." He turned to walk away. "Wait!" she said a little louder than she'd actually meant to. He turned back to her looking sadly curious. "Is that really all you want me to do?" Gold frowned, as if he didn't quite understand her. "I mean, there must be something else that I could be doing," she added quickly, wondering if she had just committed some outlandish breach of scientist-intern protocol. "Even something very simple?" "Well," the man seemed to think for a moment, "if something should happen to burst into flames, you can put the fire out or pull the fire alarm." Before she could say anything else, he was gone. There were very few places in the installation that felt reasonably private, and technically, none that really were. However, the determination and tenacity with which human beings strive to meet their needs is essentially the story of human survival. The need for privacy was as strong as the need for security, or social contact, or gratification, or any other kind of need. When two human needs merged, they usually became much more than the sum of their parts. How much more depended on which needs were involved. When one of them happened to be the sex drive, virtually nothing could stand in the way. In the installation, the sex drive went hand in hand with the need for privacy, so it didn't take long for things to happen. Restricting sex was the best the military could or would do. Forbidding it was out of the question. Thanks to millennia of accumulated experience, Command in the 26th century knew better than even to try a thing, regardless of the circumstances. Thus it was that in the complex, regulations permitted grunts to screw each other senseless, while interns could frolic with other interns, but there was to be no crossover between the two. No fraternizing between grunts and interns. Command level promised that the rule would be heavily enforced. This only served to ensure that it would be broken within an hour of its being issued by, unsurprisingly, the sex maniacs. Having been grunts themselves before their selection for fast-track re-education in the sciences, they were already experienced at remaining undiscovered, while circumventing rules that inconvenienced them. This gave them a clear advantage from the start, even beyond the motivation provided by their unswerving dedication to the proposition. That grunts had solved the problem was not actually as surprising as it might have seemed at first glance. The grunts were the de facto experts on privacy as well as the lack of it by virtue of the simple fact that barracks had been their standard accommodation from time out of mind. And the super-secret, ultra-expensive underground complex was no exception. Barracks dwellers down through the ages have learned a multitude of tricks, making certain adjustments to allow for the ever-changing times, as well as inventing new ones when necessary. In fact, it's probably safe to say that grunt-style ingenuity and inventiveness has had as much to do with the survival and advancement of the species in general as anything else has. Considering that, as interns, the sex maniacs enjoyed the privilege of private rooms, it was probably also safe to say, at least in their case, you could take the grunts out of the barracks, but you couldn't take the barracks out of the grunts. The sex maniacs weren't the only ex-grunts to become interns. Roughly half the groups were soldiers who had been successfully retrained. The rest of the interns were civilians, or had been civilians, which the military had recruited from other projects. Some had come voluntarily, and some had been forcibly drafted. The sex maniacs discovered inadvertently that it was actually quite easy for them to tell which was which without having to come right out and ask. Those belonging to the latter group were never interested in getting laid. This went along with their firm belief that there was one and only one truly reliable method for gauging the quality of life. Sex equals good. No sex equals bad. Indeed, they were appalled at having to be in service with people whose lives, from their standpoint, weren't worth living. As content as the three of them had always been in the military, separately and together, this was why they were all virulently opposed to any sort of draft. You didn't have to be the sharpest knife in the drawer to know that these were not the kind of people you wanted to have around you in a combat situation, something that could spring up at any moment no matter how peaceful things seemed to be. Your best chance of survival was among soldiers who had as much to live for as you did. Knowing that there wasn't actually very much they could do about the military's more ill-advised actions, they did the only thing they could. They continued to have as much sex as possible. Perhaps that would promulgate good karma and thus reawaken any will to live that might have gone dormant. And if not, what the hell? Sex was still its own reward. Since the military only regulated sexual activity rather than forbidding it, there were certain areas that had been set aside to allow recreation in private. Command was unwavering in its insistence that rooms in the no-tell-motel, as the grunts called it, were not under surveillance. If there actually were any people naive enough to believe that, none of them were grunts. Most grunts had been in long enough to know that, in fact, their sex lives were of little to no interest to those doing the surveillance, and they were right. If their methods of getting around rules and regulations bordered on divine inspiration, what they did after that was neither original or imaginative. But that wasn't really the point anyway. It was the principle of the thing. Thus, even when the grunts weren't violating the non-fraternization order by having sex with an unauthorized partner, they often proceeded as if they were. Pretending to break the rules was almost as much fun as breaking them. The method pioneered by the sex maniacs to get around the lack of privacy owed a great deal to Craig's background in encryption and steganography. It was also deceptively easy. All a privacy-loving individual had to do was log into the holo gaming area, set up an avatar as a decoy, and then, while the avatar was playing the game, slip through a trapdoor in the software that allowed access to the infrastructure of the holographic setting. The access was actually for the convenience of engineers intending to perform software maintenance. To the grunts, who were intending to perform something else entirely, it was akin to hiding behind the scenery on a stage set. In this case, however, they were slightly more involved. They were encrypted in the holo setting, whatever it was, jungle, city, ocean, asteroid, and at the same time inert to it, unable to affect it without the pertinent program codes. If the ambiance wasn't ideal, privacy was all but guaranteed. Short of a complete power failure, there wasn't much chance of being exposed. Well, not unless someone decided to take a close look. But that was the beauty of the whole thing. No one who used the holo gaming area, conveniently or otherwise, was going to blow the whistle, while those who didn't game had no interest in anything that went on there. Dr. Stein, for example, found the prospect of examining surveillance records from the gaming area about as desirable as several hours with Gunnar Gottman nude. Chapter 15. Lynn was stretched out on the narrow bed in her cell, as everyone else seemed to call it, with her headphones on, trying to shut out all the distractions of other people. Other people's noise and other people's secrets trapped within the enclosed space of the complex, all constantly under surveillance. No one had had to tell her that she, along with everyone else here, was being monitored all the time. Even if no human being was watching the surveillance, it was all being recorded. She was sure that powerful AIs were always monitoring absolutely everything, ready to alert human monitors to anything they found suspicious. The knowledge made her feel naked all the time, not just when she was as good as naked wearing an all-body condom. She even found herself wondering if her thoughts couldn't have been monitored in some way as well. But that couldn't be, she told herself. If that had been true, she'd never been allowed into the complex, because they'd have recognized her as a spy. She would probably have ended up as inert, helpless, and sedated as those grunts from the 3 Mile Island plant, including Rena Sophira. Lynn was still trying to process the information that the woman who had enabled her to escape from the chaos and death at 3 Mile Island, to put as much space as possible between herself and that killing machine, was now a helpless captive. God only knew what hideous fate lay in store for a grunt who had been diagnosed as beyond help. She doubted that Sophira or any of the other grunts in that ward had really been damaged beyond repair by what had happened at 3 Mile Island. When she had last seen Sophira, just before leaving 3 Mile Island forever, she had seemed remarkably unscathed by her ordeal. When Lynn had tracked down her name to this military research complex, she had assumed the lieutenant had been reassigned to guard duty there, not sedated and shoved into a ward full of people who, supposedly, were checked in at the last medical pit stop before death. The scientists tried to tell Lynn that when Sophira's eyes opened, it was some kind of involuntary muscle spasm, neuronal misfire or some such bullshit, that she hadn't really been waking up or becoming aware. Like hell, thought Lynn, because if that was the case, why had they been so fast to shoot Sophira full of medication, which was almost certainly more sedative? After which, there had certainly been no more involuntary muscle spasms. Lynn knew the grunts, whether lieutenants or higher ranks, were just there to be used, as far as the military and anyone like Dr. Stein working with them were concerned. And she had the very strong feeling that by the time Stein or anyone else on her scientific team had finished with them, Rena Sophira and all the other grunts lying still and helpless in that ward were going to be all used up, as in flush into the recycling bin, as in shove into the furnaces and save for money on fuel, as in gone. It was bad enough, Lynn thought, that these scientists were using skin bags that looked exactly like human beings, let alone that they were using real live human beings as experimental subjects. She knew that she owed Sophira her freedom, and almost certainly her life. There was no way she was going to let the lieutenant get used like some leftover piece of tissue. For all her determination, though, she came up blank on exactly how she was going to get Sophira out of the ward. She realized that time was short. In fact, for all she knew, Sophia was already on the way out of the ward to whatever fate awaited her. On the way out of life. She was scared. She was angry. But more than anything, she was resolute. There was always a way. Closing her eyes, she tried to let the sound of her favorite music calm her. In the absence of the famous LROs, it was the best she could do. No doubt LROs were better and faster and more reliable, but she had a feeling that the long-term effects might be distinctly unpleasant, undesirable, and rather more difficult to cure than anxiety. I don't have anything against the sex maniacs. Gold looked at Supreme Allah wearily. I just question whether they're actually intelligent enough for the kind of intrigue that doesn't involve getting someone into bed. They are very intelligent people, Supreme Allah said patiently. He sat back and put his feet up on his desk, much to Gold's undisguised displeasure. The good doctor had never discovered the joys of going barefoot. They are just hyperactive. Now Gold looked pained. Well, that's one way to put it. You have worked with all the interns, yes? Have the sex maniacs been wanting in some way? God, yes. Gold gave a short laugh. It's what they're wanting all the time, and not just in some way, in every way. Supreme Allah shook his head. If everything is double entendre for you, too, then you should be able to reach an understanding with them most easily. The scientist glowered at him. Didn't Dr. Haddad O'Reilly ever tell you that nobody loves a smartass? Supreme Allah raised his eyebrows. Fatima, surely you've got to be joking. It was just a fluke that Cray was the only one not reaping the rewards of his own background in encryption when Supreme Allah's call came in that evening. He had forgone doing the hollow sidestep in favor of hanging out in the lounge with the new intern. He'd known that there was no chance they would end up doing anything more than listening to music or watching 3D together, but he was broad-minded, and besides, tomorrow was another day. As it turned out, once the conversation got going, he had actually done most of the talking. Not because he'd intended to, it was just that she had asked him a shitload of questions. Stuff about being a grunt, and how he had been retrained, stuff about the complex, what the scientists were really like, what was Ramirez Gold always so sad about, and was there something going on between Zelda and Fredo? Which, that one was a good one. Somewhere in the conversation he mentioned LeBlanc, and they ended up talking about him a lot, even though Cray had barely said a dozen words to the guy in the whole time he'd been there, right up to the day he disappeared. It seemed as if she would have been perfectly happy to sit there listening to him all night, but eventually, Cray found himself getting tired of the sound of his own voice. He pretended to be sleepy and went back to his quarters. Feeling a strange mixture of disappointment and uneasiness he knew had no connection with him not having had sex. Then Supreme Allah had phoned, and he'd put the whole thing out of his mind. When Supreme Allah had been introduced to him as the man in charge of the interns and therefore his immediate superior, Cray had not been quite sure what to make of him. He had met all kinds in the military, and that included kinds that he had never imagined, and that was only taking humans into account. The Allies exchange program had already been well underway at the time of his enlistment, so he had gone through boot camp with a wide variety of colors and textures, not to mention a few tentacles, tubes, and tails. The underlying point of boot camp had remained unchanged for centuries. 2 months of that, and you came out the other side knowing there was nothing you didn't have in common with any of your fellow grunts, sisters, brothers, and others. Retraining had been as rigorous as boot, but in an entirely different way. Cray had come out of it still very much a grunt at heart, never suspecting that he would be reporting to a civilian authority. Thus, his first thought on seeing Supreme Allah, dark and bony in soft gauzy white tunic and trousers, unrestrained dreadlocks draped over his shoulders and streaming down his back, was to wonder if the aliens he'd gone through boot with had thought that Rastafarians had tentacles. He then realized that the man wasn't military. Putting a civilian in charge was a concession to the interns who were grunts in name only. Privately, Cray was rather surprised they'd thought it was really necessary to make a point of having such an obvious civilian in a management or command position. They could have chosen some NCO and just let the interns think they were working for someone not in the military. Any non-commissioned officer with half a brain could have pulled that off easy. There must have been civilians somewhere on the project with a hell of a lot of stroke. Non-military leadership was completely unfamiliar to most of the grunts, including Cray, who wondered if any civilian could hold their own in the midst of a military complex. It became clear right away that Supreme Allah could. The guy was just plain smart. He had everyone's number, including the scientists, most of whom deferred to him at one time or another in at least subtle ways. This was something that all the interns found interesting to various degrees. Cray himself didn't think it was all simply down to the man's superior stock or ganja rope. On the other hand, he didn't rule it out completely either. After all, it was some pretty goddamn good ganja. And for anyone who wasn't getting laid, it had to be the only thing that would make them even vaguely glad to be alive. He was mildly disappointed to find that Supreme Allah hadn't summoned him to his red, gold, and green den for a little midweek rope-a-dope. His position gave him the privilege of 2 rooms plus bath, as opposed to the scientist's full-size apartments or the single cells the interns occupied. Cray had no doubt that Supreme Allah's decor was unique. The red, gold, green, beaded curtains, the icons, tapestries, and art had been arranged in such a way that although Cray had never had any trouble finding the laboratory, even after a full foot of rope, he still couldn't figure out where the bedroom was. Cray told himself he hadn't really expected any ganja. As far as any of the interns knew, Supreme Allah never got anyone roped during the week. He claimed that rushing to ingest a counteractive agent to neutralize the effects and sober up after too short a period of time was a disservice to the sacrament, as Cray saw it. This was just one more thing the man was right about. What Supreme Allah did want, on the other hand, was something he would not have imagined even if he had been roped. "I did know that you were abstaining from the usual nightly game," Supreme Allah told him as they sat on the comfortable collection of pillows that served as a sofa. "You did?" Cray felt a faint ripple of uneasiness passing through him. "Only Alonzo and Pal are logged into the gaming area. Scavenger treasure hunt." "If you say so. Like you said, I abstained." He shrugged, doing his best to keep his expression neutral. "Abstinence," Supreme Allah nodded, sly and knowing. "They say it makes the heart grow fonder. You think they're right?" His smile widened. "Or do you think it's something other than the heart?" Cray intended to give a polite laugh to cover his unease, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. Never mind, Supreme Allah said, making a dismissive motion with one bony hand. "This is not a raid. Your secret stays a secret. The wise man does not tell everything he knows." He frowned suddenly. "So breathe." "I am breathing," Cray said, feeling a little embarrassed. "You are now." Supreme Allah looked amused. "Interns and grunts are not the only ones who have discovered this useful feature. All who know of it are also mindful that the deception will not stand up to close examination, which, of course, most people are not knowledgeable enough to do in the first place. More than once an avatar has passed for real, unquestioned, even among the real themselves." "Oh, yeah?" Cray frowned. If he had heard that from another grunt, he'd have laughed it off. Avatars were pretty good, but he had never thought they were anywhere near that good. Supreme Allah, on the other hand, wasn't given to mistaking vapor for gold. He laughed a little nervously. "So, where do you go?" "Who said anything about me?" This time the wave of unease that swept through him was almost intense enough to produce a little vertigo. Man, there was definitely something really, really non-normal going on around here tonight, he thought. Zelda and the new intern had said something pretty goddamn similar to each other just this morning. And that couldn't have been any goddamn coincidence, that was for sure. In a top-secret military installation like this, there was no such thing as coincidence. Alright then, but what the hell was creeping him out other than the possibility of getting canned for a little off-campus horizontal bop? Cray shook his head slightly to clear it and looked around the living room, wondering if there could have been so much residual rope in the furnishings that it was possible to get high just by breathing the air. "Okay." Supreme Allah gave a long and somewhat put-upon sigh. "Then just tell me one thing. Is this a bad time to ask for a favor?" Cray gave serious consideration to undertaking the task alone. There was really no reason why he couldn't have under the circumstances. It was just that it went against standard grunt training. Nobody ever went completely solo on a covert operation, no matter what it was. Not unless they knew for certain that there wasn't anyone around them they could trust. He was goddamn lucky not to have that problem. He had been sure that neither Alonzo nor Pal would thank him for barging in on them, and man, he had been right about that. The holographic sidestep was so convenient and easy that Cray couldn't help feeling nervous sometimes. Was it really possible that Command wasn't onto the whole dodge and just waiting for the right moment to spring some kind of trap? When he had shared his misgivings with Alonzo and Pal, both of them had conceded that it wasn't out of the question. But what if that's the case? Alonzo had added, looking wise in spite of the fact that A, they were all sweating languidly in the steam room, and B, there was a happy face on his midsection composed entirely of hickeys, except for his navel, which served as the nose, courtesy of an especially playful lady grunt. We all might as well have as much sex as we possibly can while we're waiting for the axe to fall, unless you can think of a better way to pass the time. He's right, Pal said. They've got us anyway, so we might as well make the most of however much time we got left. The last few words had seemed to snag on something in Cray's mind. He had felt the goose walk over his grave, sending a chill through him that momentarily canceled out the heat and raised goosebumps visible to the other two on his sweaty skin. However much time we've got left seemed to have an ominous quality to it beyond what Pal had intended. The memory bobbed to the surface of his thoughts as Cray slipped out of the main area of the holo game currently online and into the backstage area. But he didn't pay much attention to it. At the moment, he was more concerned with just how pissed off his fellow sex maniacs were going to be. If the situation had been reversed, he probably would have kicked ass first and asked questions later. As it turned out, Pal had a more tempered response, even if neither he nor the enchanting Linda Newmanen were particularly thrilled. To his unconcealed delight, however, he managed to pull Alonzo away before a certain playful lady grunt could finish refreshing the whimsical design on his torso in her own unique way. The half-circle looked like a lopsided rising sun with a belly button, which Cray thought looked even funnier. He stopped laughing, however, when Linda insisted on coming with them. So Stein leaves her goddamn lab unlocked and unguarded? Alonzo asked Linda incredulously. Linda paid no attention to him. She was flattened against the wall, peering around the corner to the next hallway. Dr. Stein's office was barely 10 feet away, and it was indeed unlocked and unguarded, according to the readings on her handheld anyways. Well, prodded Alonzo. Does she? Linda drew back and turned to him. Yes, she does. Probably just as a convenience for herself, since the security system in the hallway is fully armed and active. She showed him the data on the Sentinel screen. You couldn't breathe the air within 10 feet of her office without alerting her. So how the hell are we supposed to get around that? Pal gave Cray a moderately disgruntled look. Linda smiled fondly at him and pinched his smooth cheek between her finger and thumb. Interdimensional travel, honey. She herded them all back down the hall to the stairs and led them up to the next floor. 5 minutes later, she was shimmying through an air duct in her underwear, her Sentinel large securely in her bra, and Cray's comlink much less secure in her ear due to a lousy fit. Too bad she hadn't brought her own comm, but she had never imagined for a moment that she was going to need it. She had been all set for a few hours of very friendly and completely gratuitous sex, not an impromptu covert op. She certainly wouldn't have been crawling through the walls in her best fuck-me lingerie right now, if not for the fact that Cray had said the magic word, Stein. She didn't mind postponing the pleasures of the flesh for the sake of something that involved getting an edge on that grizzle bitch. You guys had better not forget you're going to owe me major for this, she whispered as she reached a T-junction. Where are you? Pal's voice was tiny and filtered in her ear. Just about to slither into the space between the very floor you boys are standing on and the ceiling of Stein's office. If I'll fit, she added silently. This looked like it was going to be an even tighter squeeze than the one she had just come through. It was also a lot dustier. Thank God she had opted for permanent respiratory filters right after boot. The surgery had been expensive and a bit more painful than advertised, but in the end it had been worth it about 1,000,000 times over. She had been spared environmental asthma over and over again. God only knew what wasn't going to end up in her lungs after this. She maneuvered past the T-junction so she could change her position from feet first to head first, and began pulling herself forward with her elbows. Immediately her bra dragged downwards, the straps impairing the movement of her arms. Fuck it, she thought, reaching behind with one hand and springing the clasp so that the bra would just come off as she inched forward. Unfortunately, it meant having to leave her sentinel behind along with it, but there was nothing she could do about that. Her panties were less cooperative. By the time she reached the access to the ceiling in Dr. Stein's office, they had become an uncomfortable, lumpy roll around her hips. "Where are you now?" asked Pal. "As far as I can tell, directly under you," she replied. She could hear muffled footsteps as he paced back and forth almost directly above her, causing dust to shower down on her intermittently. "Hold still, will you? Your pacing is driving me crazy." The footsteps came to an abrupt stop. "Sorry." "She's not stuck, is she?" asked Alonzo in the background. "No, I'm not stuck," she said, amused. "Just don't let me forget to pick up my underwear on my way out, okay?" "Pardon?" said Pal with some alarm. "You took off your underwear?" "Had to. There was no other way," she said. "Never mind. You had to be there." "Could somebody tell Corporal Nin this isn't a sex fantasy?" Alonzo said, sounding impatient. She chuckled some more as Pal and Cray shushed him. "Well, maybe it's not his sex fantasy," she said, unable to help herself. Alonzo sounded practically prim, which was some kind of accomplishment considering what a horny little bastard he actually was. "Be serious for a minute, Linda," Pal said tensely. "Are you really all right?" "Right as rock and roll," she said. "Now shut up, I need to save my breath here." She practically had to dislocate her shoulder to reach the vent panel in the office ceiling, which made it even more difficult to feel how the panel was attached. There were no screws, brackets, or hinges that she could locate. Pulling the panel up towards her was no good. Hoping for the best, she thrust her stiffened fingers against it as hard as she could. The vent popped out of the ceiling and fell to the floor, with an oddly muffled thump, barely missing the edge of Stein's desk. "Now, if only I can land that easily," she muttered. "What?" Pal asked, his filtered voice high and anxious. "Are you all right?" She groaned. "For the umpteenth time, yes, I'm fine." "Linda, are you absolutely sure that you couldn't have gone directly into the lab instead?" came Cray's voice suddenly. "I just looked at the blueprint again, and the ducts don't look like they're that much smaller than any of the ones leading into Stein's office. And they say men have better spatial judgment," she laughed at him. "Listen, babe, you'll just have to trust me when I tell you the lab ducts don't have to be that much smaller than this one to be impossible. Not one of you guys could have made it even half this far without getting stuck. If I bought a bra this tight, I'd suffocate." "Say again?" "Shh! I'm concentrating." Finally, she maneuvered herself past the access to the ceiling so that she could try wiggling through the opening in the ceiling feet first. It was an even tighter squeeze, but she managed to lower herself to the desktop instead of falling directly to the floor on her head. Her panties, however, failed to make it through. She looked up to find them dangling in shreds from the end of the vent. "Now I know how Portafoy felt back in boot camp when we ran his thong up the flagpole," she said. "Say again?" Pal sounded slightly annoyed. "I thought you were concentrating." "Oh, I am." She turned to look at the enormous humanoid figure strapped to the table in the lab on the other side of the glass partition. Jesus, it really was a friggin' monster. "I most certainly am." If she didn't know for certain that Pal, Alonzo, and Cray had been grunts before they had become interns, Linda thought, trying to block out the tiny sound of them squabbling with each other as she worked, she might have had trouble believing it. They were acting like they had never done anything other than fret over how many pinheads could dance on the head of a quark. Not like the combat-seasoned hardbodies she had served 2 years with before they had all been stationed here. She paused to dial down the volume in the comm link before she resumed wedging a flat-blade screwdriver between the glass partition and a section of the frame. The screwdriver had been quite the stroke of luck. About the last thing she would have ever expected to find under the desk in Dr. Stein's office was a toolbox, and with actual tools in it, no less. All brand new, and as far as she could tell, virtually untouched, which was even weirder, she supposed. God only knew why the stuff was there at all. Dr. Stein, do-it-yourselfer? Well, there were stranger things abroad in the universe. She glanced up briefly at the creature in the lab. An 18-inch section of the frame pulled free of the glass with a pop. She folded it down without detaching it from the wall and moved on to the next section. The 3 months she had spent in construction were once again paying off. That had been one very crap detail. Nothing but endless heavy lifting all day that left her too tired to do anything in bed other than sleep. She hadn't realized just how much practical knowledge she had picked up. let alone how far its usefulness would extend. On the other hand, she was fairly certain that there were really no way she could have foreseen how often breaking and entering was going to figure in her future activities, although not nearly as often as sex, thank God. And she fervently hoped that this was the first and last time that the two would ever intersect. "How far have you gotten?" Pal asked her faintly. "Almost halfway there," she told him, "and it'll go faster if I don't have to give you a running commentary or regular process reports, hon." She tuned him out and kept working until she had pried back every part of the frame from the glass. Then all she had to do was lever the glass away from the frame on the other side, and it would pop right out. God damn, the son of a bitch was heavy. She staggered a little under the weight of the partition, and then managed to steady it against her body. Not the most comfortable way to hold a pane of glass. Not to mention the fact that she now had to clean boob and belly prints off it before she crammed herself back into the duct again. A woman's work is never done. Laughing to herself, she set the glass down, leaning it carefully against the wall, and climbed through the opening to the lab. "Okay, guys, I'm in," she said. "How's it looking where you are?" "No harm, no alarm," Pal assured her. "You were right. Security doesn't register anything moving around inside as long as it didn't cross a designated boundary. And there's no designated boundary across any of the air ducts." "Good. If I were wrong, this would be one fucking lousy way to find out." "This is too simple," came Alonzo's voice, barely audible in the background. "Why isn't there any security on the air ducts? That's stupid." "Pal, tell old lady Alonzo about how alarms were going off every time some overgrown skin bag twitched," she growled. "But do it away from the link. You guys are really starting to get on my fucking nerves." She found herself tiptoeing cautiously around the thing on the table, her arms cuddled protectively against her chest. Christ, it really was a monster, just by virtue of its size, if nothing else. There may have been a few grunts and black ops that big, but not many, and nobody she knew personally, except maybe for one guy. She frowned, trying to remember his name. Brady? Bradfield? No, Brodsky. That was it. Not someone she had really known except in passing, although she would have liked to. Big and beautiful, but not stuck on himself. A lifer with a pretty distinguished service record. Then some kind of bodyguard or babysitting detail went bad, which also had something to do with the Solaris disaster. Brodsky ended up flaming out, literally, on a long fall from the wild black yonder. How did that old Prevac slogan go again? Better to burn up than fade away? Something like that? She pushed the thought away, eyeing the figure on the table. Rumor had it this creature of Stein's was somehow connected to both it and the fuck-up at 3 Mile Island. Sounded pretty far-fetched to her, like a wet dream from one of those conspiracy geeks that somehow always homed in on her brother Dan in bars. But damn, the way the thing looked in that body armor, like it could have destroyed Solaris single-handedly and then dropped down on 3 Mile Island without a parachute. "Concentrate," she ordered herself firmly. "Pal," she said, tapping the comm link to turn up the volume again. "Did you say there were already some tissue samples that Stein took, or am I going to have to dig them out myself?" "Look around and see if you can find any containers with labels on them." "Now I'm on a naked scavenger hunt. Great." Linda gave a long, exasperated sigh as she turned to the counter behind her, putting her back to the creature. "Can you give me any hints as to what these labels might say? Monster mash, creature feature, pi to 10 places?" "Sine, cosine, cosine, sine. 3.1159, Cray chanted. "Tell Cray if that's his idea of a dirty limerick, he shouldn't quit his day job," she muttered, moving down to the double sink at the end of the counter on her left. Nothing there, not even soap. Next to it was a piece of equipment she recognized as a centrifuge. Lifting the cover, she looked inside, but the few test tubes inside were clean and empty. She barely glanced at the small pressure plate scale next to that. "Try looking around for some kind of half-height refrigerator unit under the counter," Pal suggested. She stepped back and had a look. Nothing but plain cabinet doors. "Do you see anything?" "Not yet. Give me a minute," she said, opening the first door at the far end. "It's getting late," complained Alonzo. "Hey, anyone who's tired can pack it in and go to bed," she snapped, "including me." She went on to the next set of doors. "Nothing," she announced after reaching the other end. "Looks like I have to play doctor with this guy. Who wants to talk me through it, and keep it simple, will ya?" "I hear and obey," Pal answered, Just take a blood sample." "Should have done that in the first place, don't you think?" she muttered, grabbing a sterile-wrapped syringe out of a nearby tray. "Okay, you guys have a preference, or should I just take what I can get? Don't answer that," she added quickly, tearing the packaging off the syringe and then noticing there was no wastebasket. Hell with it, she thought, crumpling the plastic and tossing it into the nearest cabinet. Linda had drawn blood plenty of times under a wide variety of conditions. It wasn't really difficult, although it could be tricky finding a vein with some people. With this guy, the problem wasn't finding a vein. The problem was finding skin to expose. The body armor wouldn't budge, and pushing the needle through the rubbery cloth, or whatever it was, would probably contaminate the sample. Maybe she could try the blood vessels under the eyes. No, not in this lifetime. She wasn't that good with the needle. She made a careful inch-by-inch inspection of the area around the edge of his mask, from just under his left ear up to his temple across his brow, where a hairline would have been, and down the other side. Still nothing. Not even a centimeter of bare skin. Like that mask-like thing on his face had been put on and then hermetically sealed to the front of his head. She froze, holding the needle up and away from the body in one hand, the other resting lightly on the cheek area of the mask. There was a glint of light from the darkness of the eye hole. She could have sworn that thing's eyes had been shut when she had come in, but now, try as she might, she couldn't remember whether she had actually seen that for herself, or whether she had just taken it for granted. But okay, what if his eyes were open after all? So what? It didn't mean he was conscious. Stein had him paralyzed after all. Linda suddenly became aware of her heart pounding too hard and fast in her chest. "Don't panic," she ordered herself. "You're too smart to panic, too good, too experienced. You're just a little freaked because you're doing all this goddamn shit buck naked. Just take a look at this freak and you'll see for yourself there's nothing going on. Nothing to be afraid of. Even if you were wearing a tank. Nothing." She leaned over the creature so she could get a good look in his eyes. They were wide open, unblinking and staring up at nothing. That's right, nothing. Our theme of the evening, nothing. As in, nothing to be afraid of. All at once she became aware that she had been holding her breath. She started to let it out when the creature's eyes suddenly swiveled in their sockets and looked directly at her. It was just by reflex that she opened her mouth to scream, but before she could even try to take a breath, something hard and merciless clamped itself around her neck, cutting off her air. Now that's what I call a real tight squeeze, she thought dizzily. That's a painfully tight squeeze. Patches of darkness swam through her vision, and she was dimly aware of the comm link tumbling out of her ear and bouncing off her shoulder. She could feel something in her neck crack under pressure as her feet left the floor. But the sensation was so distant now that it didn't seem to have anything to do with her. Then there was nothing at all, not even darkness. There was no expression on Dr. Stein's face as she watched the events unfolding on the large wall monitor in her living room. She'd have been expecting something like this, but she had thought it would be one of the scientists. Perhaps Gold, or possibly even Wing, doing his own dirty work. Maybe calling on one of the more devious X-Jarheads for a little help in getting around the security system. Jamming the alarms and sneaking in through the door would have been a lot less strenuous than slithering through an air duct, though not nearly as entertaining. It was a miracle that silly, oversexed Amazon had managed to pull it off, along with all of her clothes at that. Neither Gold nor Wing would have had a chance, not even if they'd been stripped naked and greased from head to toe, with a wedge of cheese tied to their balls and a starving rat in pursuit for extra incentive. And considering what she had learned from the minuscule sample of brain tissue she had been able to analyze, the little scenario that had just played out was virtually perfect. Shame about the lab, though, but she had no one to blame but herself for canceling out the restraints and allowing the creature to flail around with the grunt's body. Every single item in the room that could have been broken had been, and anything not actually destroyed had been dented, scratched, or bent. And of course, just about everything was stained with blood now. Stein watched patiently until the thing her prized specimen was clutching appeared to be nothing more than a shapeless remnant of material. It had appeared to have been dipped in some kind of slimy red goo and dragged through a trailer full of guts and punctured organs from a butcher shop. Strange. She could get no sense of emotion. Perhaps that was because she was looking at him on a monitor rather than in person. The profile she had obtained from his brain tissue had indicated rage and fear as essential elements in his original composition, among other things. Obviously modifications from the nanos. Suddenly he threw down what was left of the grunt and turned to the hole in the wall where the glass partition had been. Before he could take a step towards it, Stein hit the lighted red panel in the center of the wireless console on her lap with 2 fingers. Instantly the creature dropped to the floor as if his entire body had turned into jelly. She sat back on the couch, the faintest hint of a smile touching her hard, colorless mouth. Disrupting the electrical charge in the internal nanos, as well as his central nervous system, was one of those things she would have thought was just too easy. Of course, eventually it would be, which was to say it wasn't going to work forever. The nanos, along with his original system of regeneration, would figure out how to adapt, and then she would have to come up with some other method of immobilizing him. If all else failed, she could always freeze him, but that wasn't really a workable option in terms of super soldier project. Send 1 million super soldiers into combat along with 1 million cryo units and 1 million cryo technicians? There were probably a couple of people in the military stupid enough to consider such a thing seriously, but they weren't in charge here. But speaking of stupid, she used the console to trigger a silent alarm for the floor above her office, then leaned over and picked up the telephone. "Supreme Allah," she said. There was a second or two of dead silence before the call went through, which she found rather surprising, considering what time it was. The communication system shouldn't have been overloaded in the middle of the night. "This better be good," said the deep, hoarse voice, heavy with sleep, into the phone speaker. "This better be real goddamn good." "Well, I'm having 3 of your interns arrested for breaking into one of the offices," she answered coolly. "Ooh, that was good for me. Was it good for you too?" Okay, this has been chapters 14 and 15 of Jason X The Experiment. I hope everybody's enjoying it so far. Please check out my prior upload. I'm asking for feedback on some things from y'all, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Click the bell so you always know when there's new chapters dropping. Hit the like button. Drop me a comment. I'd love to hear from you, especially feedback from my prior video where I'm asking a certain question about how I release my content. I'm sorry if this narration is lacking any at all, but I am dealing with a little bit of kidney stones right now, so I'm in kind of constant discomfort and pain, and I'm doing the best I can. Until next time, this has been your 80s Slasher Librarian saying thanks for listening. Oh, and have a very happy Halloween.